I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas. And before we start with our lesson, right, on semicolons, colons, and commas, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts, grade 8, and then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas. All right, so we are going to be doing semicolons, colons, and commas. So we said our chapter is semicolons, colons, and commas. Our subject is English Language Arts, grade 8. And the lessons that we'll be focusing on under the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas All right. So when it comes to semicolons, so firstly, our chapter is semicolons, it is colons and commas, right? And we said our lessons that we will be focusing on under the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas is to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists, and to use semicolons and commas to separate clauses, right? So that is going to be our two focus lessons under the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas. And when it comes to a colon, right, we use a colon to introduce a list. We use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. So we use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. And if a list does not follow an independent clause, then do not use punctuation to introduce the list. So we can use a colon to introduce a list after an independent clause. And if a list does not follow an independent clause, right, then do not use any punctuations to introduce the list. For example, right, my parents have visited much of Western Europe. So my parents have visited much of Western Europe. Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Or you can say my parents have visited much of Western Europe, including Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Right? And we say that if a list does not follow an independent clause, then do not use a punctuation to introduce the list. So that is when we bring in the colon, right? So the colon is to introduce a list of an independent clause. And if the list does not include an independent clause, right? And then we do not use a punctuation to introduce the list. And then we use commas, right? We use commas to separate three or more items within a series. And we put the comma after each item within the list except for the last one. So it's like, for example, if you are sent to the shop, right? If you're sent to the shop and you are now going to get some oranges, and then you can say, I went to the shop and I bought oranges, comma, apples, comma, and pears, right? So that is basically how we use a comma to separate three or more items within a series. We put a comma after each item within the list except for the last one. So we said we put a comma after each item within the list except for the last one. For example, our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, Rachel Stein, and Linda Hu. All right. So when it comes to commas, right, and we're listing different items within a series, right, then you just need to, for example, even however how long the series is, you just continue with the commas up until you get to the last one or the last item. And then we have semicolons, right? We had a colon where we said can introduce a list of an independent clause, which is your dot dot. And then we have a semicolon, right? And we use a semicolon to separate items within a series using commas. So we use semicolons, right, to separate items in a series when using commas would be unclear, such as when one or more items within the series already contain a comma. So we basically use semicolons to separate items within a series when using our commas would be unclear. such as when one or more items in the series already contain commas. An example is our speakers will be Kevin O'Malley, an English professor, Rachel Stein, a, a print journalist, and Linda Wu, a blogger. Period. So that is basically our colons, which introduces a list of an independent clause, which is your dot, dot, and each other. Then we have commas, which is to separate three or more items within a series, right? And then we have semicolons. And semicolons, right? We use semicolons to separate items within a series when using commas would be unclear, right? For example, if like such as when one or more of the items in a series already contains commas. All right. Also, when it comes to a comma, right, then we use a comma to separate two independent clauses that are joined with a coordinating conjunction, such as and, or, but, or so, right? So that is also how we use a comma. However, if the coordinating conjunction joins verbs or verb phrases in a compound predicate, a comma should not be used. So we see that, however, if the coordinating conjunction joins verbs or verb phrases in a compound predicate, then a comma should not be used. And an example, right, of using a comma to separate two independent clauses is, for example, Wyatt was reserved around new people, comma, but he was hardly shy. That is a coordinating conjunction joined by two independent clauses. And the second one says Wyatt was reserved around new people, but was hardly shy. All right. And then we said we also can use a comma to separate a dependent clause as well as an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. And these dependent clauses, right, it usually starts with a subordinating conjunction. And a subordinating conjunction is, for example, after, although, or because. So that is a subordinating conjunction, which is after, although, because. An example of a comma that separates a dependent clause as well as an independent clause, right, is although Wyatt was reserved around new people, he was hardly shy. So although Wyatt is reserved around new people, he was hardly shy. And there we use the word although, and although is a subordinating conjunction. And subordinating conjunctions, right, is either although, it is after, or it is because. And then we said we use a semicolon to connect two closely related independent clauses that are not joined with a coordinating conjunction. For example, White was hardly shy. He was simply reserved around new people, right? So which means that these, like that semicolon, right, that was used is to connect the two closely related independent clauses that is not being joined by a coordinating conjunction. All right. And also when it comes to a semicolon, right, we also use a semicolon to connect two independent clauses that is joined by a conjunctive adverb such as consequently, however, or therefore, right? So those words can also be, can also join um, either clauses, right, when we are either using semicolons, commas, or colons. For example, Wyatt was hardly shy. Nevertheless, he was reserved around new people, right? So he was reserved around new people. He wasn't really quiet, but yes. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on a+students.ca. So we're doing our tutorial lesson on a+students.ca. So we said that we are doing our tutorial lesson on a+students.ca. So let's go to a+students.ca, which is going to be our chapter on semicolons, colons, and commas. So we're going to the first lesson, which is to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. It's like listing certain items or things. All right. And we say that we use a colon to introduce a list of an independent clause, right? And if a list does not follow an independent clause, then we do not use a punctuation to introduce the list. For example, my parents have visited much of Western Europe, colon, and now they're listing, or let's say the countries, for example, which is Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. And then we use commas to separate three or more items within a series. This is also us listing certain things, and we put the comma after each item in the list except for the last one, right? So we do not put it after the last one because there we put our period. And then we use a semicolon to separate items within a series when using commas could not be unclear, such as when one or more items in the series already contain a comma. All right. So we're not going to add commas, semicolons, or colons if needed. Otherwise, we just submit the text without any additional punctuations, right? So there we have our little boxes, and we either going to add commas, semicolons, or colons within that sentence. It says, after golfer Jack Nicklaus went professional in 1962, he won the Masters tournament 6 times, the Professional Golfers Association of American Championship 5 times, the US Open 4 times, and the British Open times, right? And if we look at that sentence, right, then it means that this is basically we're just adding commas because it is listing um it is basically separating three or more items within a series. And we can say it is after golfer Nicholas went professional in 1962, he won the Masters tournament 6 times, comma. The Professional Golf Association America Champions 5 times, comma. The US Open 4 times, comma. And then after the last one, we put a period or an endpoint. All right. And we use commas to separate three or more items within the series. And that is basically what we did over here. All right. So we either need to add a comma, we either need to add a semicolon, or we need to add a colon if needed. Otherwise, submit the text without any additional punctuation. So Mr. Dodson grows a variety of medical herbs in his garden, which is chamomile, echinacea, lavender, feverfew, and lemon balm. All right. So we then say Mr. Dodson grows a variety of medical herbs in his garden. And then we put our colon, which is dot, dot, because we are now going to list the other stuff, which is chamomile, Ichana chai, lavender, feverfew, and lemon balm. All right. Right, so we used a semicolon, and the semicolon is used, or not even a semicolon, the colon is used, and that is to introduce a list of an independent clause. So it is to introduce a list of an independent clause. All right. Now let's go to our test where we are going to use semicolons, colons, and commas with lists. Right? So we need to either add a comma, semicolon, or colon if needed. Otherwise, just submit the text without any additional punctuation. Mr. Dodson grows a variety of medicinal herbs in his garden: chamomile, echana chai, lavender, feverfew, and lemon balm. All right. So we either need to add a colon, we need to add a space, or we need to add a colon. Which one should we use? Either colon or space. So when it comes to, for example, this sentence, right? We say that when we list things after an independent clause or we introduce something after an independent clause, then we add a colon. And remember that I only said colon or space, right? Colon or space. So we're going to put our colon over there. So both colons, so that is correct. So we either going to add a comma, semicolon, or colon if needed. When Vince went to France, he visited the palace of is it Versailles or Versailles, the Père Lachaise cemetery, where his favorite writer Oscar Wilde is buried, and the Louvre. Very much French words, right? So now we need to either add a comma, we either need to add a semicolon, or we need to add a space. Are we adding a semicolon, space, or colon? So when Vince went to France, he visited the palace of Versailles or Versailles. All right. And I think if we rather want to choose the correct one, let's choose a semicolon. I don't know if we need to use both. And this is supposed to be a comma. Let's just go with semicolon. And the semicolon is correct. Some of history's most famous spies include Francis Walsingham, who spied for Queen Elizabeth the First, Nathan Hale, who spied during the Revolutionary War, and Bal Boyd, who gathered intelligence during the Civil War. All right. So which means that if there's no comma, we cannot use a colon. So which means that if we choose the correct punctuation mark, right, since there's already commas, then we will use our semicolon. And the semicolon is correct. So after golfer Jack Nicklaus went professional in 1962, he won the Masters tournament 6 times. The U.S. Professional Golfers Association of America Championship 5 times, the U.S. Open 4 times, and the British Open 3 times. All right, so which means that if we are going to, if we read our sentence, and then it means that there's a list that we are basically adding. So we're going to use our commas. And the commas is correct because we are listing a list of things that the golfer did. Right? All right. Let's go to the second lesson, which is to use semicolons and commas to separate the clauses. And we say that we use commas to separate two independent clauses that are joined with the coordinating conjunctions, and our coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, so. But if a coordinating conjunction joins a verb or a verb phrase in a compound predicate, right, then a comma should not be used. And we also use a comma to separate a dependent clause. Remember, a dependent clause is, it cannot stand on its own, right? So a dependent clause and an independent clause when the dependent, so we use a comma to separate a dependent clause as well as an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. Then these dependent clauses usually start with a subordinating conjunction. And a subordinating conjunction is, for example, after, although, or because. And now you must understand the difference between a subordinating conjunction and a coordinating conjunction, because a coordinating conjunctions, right? It joins two sentences, for example, using words like and, but, or, so. And a subordinating conjunction, right? It usually starts with words such as after, although, or because. That's a subordinating conjunction. And then we see that we use a semicolon to connect two closely related independent clauses that are joined with a coordinating conjunction, right? And we also use a semicolon to connect two independent clauses that are joined with a conjunctive adverb, such as using words as consequently, however, or therefore, right? Then we use the semicolon, right? All right. And if we look at this sentence over here, it says, Wild Leaks is a whistleblower website where people anonymously report illegal wildlife trade. The site may prove effective in the fight against wildlife crime. However, it requires internet access in order to be useful, right? So which means that if we look at this specific sentence, then we will put a semicolon, right? Because there's two independent clauses, right? And it's joined by an adverb, which is however. So we should complete the sentence with a semicolon. And there we have our semicolon. Leonardo Pisano Bigolo, also known as Fibonacci, did not exactly discover Fibonacci numbers, but he did popularize them by including them in his work Liberace. And over here, we just put a comma, right? And we just add a comma. All right, let's go to our test. We will be using semicolons and colons to separate clauses. So before Miss Sandoval saw the Bitterroot National Forest, she had no idea how stunning the landscape is in Idaho. So we now need to say, do we use a comma, a dot, or a space? Do we use a comma, a dot, or a space? So before Miss Sandoval saw the Bitterroot National Forest, she had no idea how stunning the landscape is. So we then add a comma. Yep. And the comma is correct. So well done. A comma is correct. So well done. And remember here they say we only add a comma or a semicolon if needed, right? Mother yikes climbed to higher altitudes than do males or females without calves. Researchers believe the steep mountain slopes may help protect their calves from predators and provide a richer source of food. So we now either need to add a comma or a semicolon if needed. So over here it says, do we add a semicolon? Do we add a dot or do we add a space? Semicolon, dot, or space. And if we choose the correct one, we will add a semicolon. So well done, a semicolon is correct, right? And then Wild Leaks is a whistleblower website where people anonymously report illegal wildlife trade. The site may prove effective in the fight against wildlife crime. However, it requires internet access in order to be useful. Do we add a semicolon? Do we add a dot? Or do we add a space? All right. So if we choose the correct one, we can say a semicolon, right? And there we have a semicolon. All right, last one. As William chopped the cilantro for the chili, I shredded the cheese for the quesadillas. So do we add a comma, a dot, or do we add a space? So as William chopped the cilantro for chili, I shredded the cheese for the quesadillas. Do we add a comma, dot, or space? All right, so which means that we will add a comma. All right, so that is now the end of our lesson, grade 8, on semicolons, colons, and commas. Thank you very much for joining the class. Till next time, have a good evening further. Goodbye.